we're going to be able to put things on the table. The Russians will do the same, both directly with us at NATO, at the OSCE, and we'll see if there are grounds for moving forward. But here's what I can say. First, any progress that we're going to make is going to happen on a reciprocal basis, by which I mean if the United States and Europe are taking steps to address some of Russia's concerns, Russia will have to do the same thing. Second, nothing's happening without Europe. And third, it's hard to see making actual progress as opposed to talking in an atmosphere of escalation with a gun to Ukraine's head. So if we're actually going to make progress, we're going to have to see de-escalation, Russia pulling back from the threat that it currently poses to Ukraine.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. I took a small break over Christmas and New Year's. I hope you had a healthy, joyous time. On this Backstory, Russia and Ukraine talks this week to avert war. But Russia's demands go way beyond Ukraine. And NATO and the West aren't prepared to negotiate sovereignty of independent countries anywhere in Europe. And Kazakhstan. Thousands arrested, close to 200 killed in days of violence. What was it all about? Russia had its troops there too. A coup? A popular uprising? Maybe a bit of both. Have a listen to this. All right, I want to introduce you to Mollie Saltskog, who is a senior intelligence analyst at the Soufan group, which I've used a lot in podcasts. I mean, the Soufan has some great analysts, and Mollie, no doubt, is going to be the best yet.
Thank you.
Mollie, thanks for doing this. Kazakhstan, what just happened? Because not only was it physically foggy as the fighting was going on in the streets of Kazakhstan, different cities in Kazakhstan, but I think really, figuratively speaking, the fog is still clearing. We don't know who was behind this violence.
No, you're absolutely right, Dana. And I think there might be some time if we ever get transparency on it. But in short, for your listeners, what we saw in the first 2 weeks of this year were large-scale anti-government protests that gripped Kazakhstan. And reports suggest that more than 160 people have been killed, some of them including children, which is absolutely horrible. And thousands, if not around 10,000 people have been arrested. And I think what's key here, what you touched on, is that what started as these organic protests in the country's west on January 2nd that were sparked by, grievances about doubling fuel prices, they quickly spread organically across the country in the following days. And whilst these grievances about the fuel prices were the initial, spark, it's important to understand that the tensions that manifested themselves in these large-scale anti-government protests, they've been brewing for a while, and they're much more to do with discontent of a lack of, political and economic reforms that have been promised the people of Kazakhstan for a long time. However, at one point, as you mentioned, these peaceful demonstrations became violent, and government buildings were set aflame, and there was large-scale looting and fighting in the streets, and it's still unclear who was behind this violence.
Unlike Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or some of the other stands, Kazakhstan is one of the richest Central Asian countries. It can stand on its own because of oil wealth, right? So, and there's a lot of discontent for the fact that you have the ruling elite, probably 150, 180 people, whose pockets are full while the rest of the country is very poor, as you've toured there. But was this an internal power struggle, do you think, by the clans there, the rich elite?
So the short answer is no. As far as the peaceful protests go, this was organic, fueled by legitimate and diverse grievances. However, I agree that there are, when people ask themselves, where did these violent hijacking elements come from? There are a couple of different, theories. One is much more simpler than the other. The one report is, some reporting is that, the ruling government, authoritarian government, just wanted to have an excuse to use violence against these peaceful protesters that were uniting more and more day by day. The other one is a bit more of a deliberate. The other, theory or reporting from the ground is that this is a bit more of a deliberate scheme by the current president Tokayev to purge the former ex-president Nazarbayev's, his supporters that are still in the ruling party, and that the blaming of these that it was outside forces and terrorists also infiltrating the protest allowed him to call on the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization for assistance, because he doesn't necessarily trust the internal security apparatus, which until recently was headed by Masimov, who is a loyal ally to Nazarbayev, the former president.
This President Tokayev, who was set up by Nazarbayev, who ruled the country after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, he was an original member of the Communist Politburo. And then when Kazakhstan declared independence, Nazarbayev has stayed in power election after election in, what largely has been a pretend democracy by Western standards. But Tokayev has come out now and said that the deadly violence last week was an attempted coup. He told leaders of the military alliance of ex-Soviet states the action had been coordinated by, quote, a single center, but he didn't name those responsible. That's very interesting.
It is very interesting. And
what's the single center? You want to take a run at it?
Again, there are so many unconfirmed reports, and I think that we've learned from history that trusting, the authoritarian ruler or government of a country when they cite coups, etc. We've seen that happen in Turkey. We've seen that happening in other parts of the world. We got to take it with a grain of salt, right? But I mean, Tokayev's actions, just removing Nazarbayev from his Security Council post and then resting Karim Masimov, the head of Kazakhstan's former head, I should say, of their intelligence, on suspicion of treason would indicate that indeed he is purging, pro-Nazarbayev elements within the current government structure. Now, if that's because they were planning a coup, or because he could, under the guise of this popular uprising and anti-protest that were largely anti-Nazarbayev focused too, we should mention to your listeners, it remains to be seen. I
mean, nobody wants to say that they turned the guns on their own people, right? So if you can say it's outside influence, these are terrorists, coordinated by a single center, which he needs to explain, and he was dealing with a coup d'etat, then it looks like he didn't put down, a grassroots movement in Kazakhstan, but he dealt with external motivated, forces. So it gives him some kind of shield against public opinion. But I think most people on the ground inside Kazakhstan will know who was shot and who wasn't. And what this was all about. I mean, in long term, I would think it doesn't lead to a restful nation. That's for sure.
No, and listen, Dana, what you're talking about is just a classic trick from the authoritarian playbook to delegitimize peaceful protests that are voicing legitimate grievances, like the people of Kazakhstan did. And we've seen this argument by authoritarians leader over and over again, in Hong Kong, Belarus, Myanmar, etc. But it is a key part of this, blaming outside forces, terrorists, and Putin, naming this as a color revolution. It's very key to the argument that Tokayev had to make this argument to call on the Russian CSTO for assistance, that it was outside forces, that it was terrorists that were, attacking the country, rather.
Right. These color revolutions referred to, I have to remember now, Velvet Revolution in Georgia, and then the Orange Revolution, and then it turned into the revolution in Kiev that brought down the pro-Kremlin government of Yanukovych. So Putin stands up after he, sends his military muscle to Tokayev's aid, saying that, this is yet another color revolution, blaming outsiders. But you very much think that that's more of a smokescreen.
Absolutely. And, if the listeners are interested in understanding more about the grassroots movements of these protests and the grievances, I will point them to an excellent piece by Eric Emirat and Asel Tutumov in Foreign Policy, because they explain much more eloquently than I ever could about why these protests are unprecedented for Kazakhstan and why they're very, very different from other popular uprisings we've seen in the former Soviet states. And basically, the argument is that these
and by the way, Putin hates the unrest on Russia's border, right?
Exactly.
Because he fears the same thing happening in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Well, and he wants to exert his influence over these former Soviet states. But to sum up, these protests they transcended class, religion, and politics in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think that was frightening both for Tokayev, but also for Putin.
Frightening for Putin, indeed. Russia has tugged at Kazakhstan before, and Nazarbayev was always, very canny at keeping the wolf at an arm's length. Has Tokayev just made a strategic error in Kazakhstan independence now by using Russian military muscle?
I think this is a excellent question, Dana. And the honest answer, which is maybe not so satisfactory, is it remains to be seen. It was announced on January 11 that the troops that Russia sent under the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, they'll be leaving in the next 10 days, Tokayev said. We'll see if that happens. We've seen from history that it's much harder to get rid of Russian troops than them coming into the country, so to speak. And if that troop withdrawal doesn't happen, Tokayev is in big trouble, because he will likely be perceived as a very weak leader who, which was the risk when he called for outside help. But if he can't make the Russian CSTO troops leave, then he's really, maybe perceived even as a puppet of Moscow and Putin. But I think one other interesting part of this is, even say that the troops leave, the question is still there. What is Putin going to get for all of this trouble that he went through? He really came to Tokayev's aid, and how is he going? Putin is an opportunist. We know this from all the other things that he has done recently. How is he going to transform this military assistance that he lended Kazakhstan and Tokayev specifically into additional leverage for Russia in Kazakhstan?
Well, you wrote about gas in one of your articles, and you said, with Russia, the marriage is not without its looming troubles. Chinese-funded natural gas pipelines through Central Asia provide the former Soviet republics with a market and transportation network that cuts out Russia. And just as Moscow laments the loss of influence in Eastern Europe, growing Chinese economic and diplomatic clout threatened to replace Russia's role in Central Asia. So this was an opportunity for Putin to reassert that role and cut out China when they're, maybe you want to take a stab at this as well, when they are supposed to be great partners kind of against American and Western interests in Central Asia.
Absolutely. This is another fascinating aspect of what we can defer from what happened in Kazakhstan from a geopolitical perspective in Central Asia. We finally get to see kind of where the chips fall between China and Russia. I mean, most experts and analysts have mused that this is a marriage of convenience between China and Russia, rather deal with each other than Washington in their backyard, basically. And it has been commonly perceived, that China and Russia have this very tacit agreement in Central Asia that China is dominant in the economic sphere and Russia is the region's security guarantor. And we really got to see how that plays out in practice. Indeed, Russia is the security guarantor. They went in, they were called upon, they went in. And it's important because over the past couple of years, like the piece you cited that I wrote, experts and analysts, including myself, have mused that, is China in many ways infringing not only economically in Russia's traditional sphere of influence in Central Asia, but also perhaps militarily, security-wise, with increased bilateral engagement over counterterrorism concerns and trainings with Central Asian countries, including Kazakhstan. And
this tale says essentially they may be, but they're not at the point that they replace Russia.
Yes, and actually, if we look at the recent days as statements from official statements from China, they actually seemed quite pleased about it. They didn't have to really lift a finger. They lended rhetorical support and said, we are here and we support the Kazakh government and we support, dispelling these outside forces who are, causing torment and instability in Kazakhstan. But they were happy to just have Russia stabilize Kazakhstan for everyone's benefit in this marriage of convenience, so to speak.
Mollie Saltskog at the Soufan Group. Mollie, it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dana.
All right, joining me now from Brussels is Olga Oliker with the International Crisis Group, and Olga is an expert and one of the best people I've talked to about Russia and Ukraine. Hi, Olga.
Hi, good to be back.
Russia says there's no intention to invade Ukraine. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov says he's assured his U.S. counterpart, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, that the fears of a Russian invasion are absolutely unfounded. Is this some farcical lie? Because how do we even set up the discussions with NATO and what's happening in Ukraine if we don't think that there's a Russian threat there to begin with?
So we do think there's a threat. You may remember in 2014. Shortly before the annexation of Crimea, there were lots of Russian officials and members of parliament saying that Russia had no intention of annexing Crimea. Within a day or so, they were all voting for the annexation of Crimea. But it's also, you've got all these troops, right? You've got Russian troops near the border with Ukraine. They're
What's the point of lying about it? What's the point of pretending, through smoke and mirrors that they're not there?
Because you want to maintain as much freedom of maneuver as possible for as long as possible, because you don't want to give away your hand, because you want to control the narrative to the extent possible. And if you say this is, and it's not that they're conclusively, I don't think they've conclusively decided that they're going to, they've already invaded Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine in 2014, but that there's going to be a major escalation. They have the option. Arguably they always have that option. They just now have that option with a whole lot more troops nearby. I don't think it's that unusual in international politics not to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And if we spend a lot of time getting mad at representatives of foreign ministries for being less than fully honest, well, we're going to spend a lot of our time being very, very angry.
So you hold the dagger to Europe's throat and to Ukraine's throat. But you deny that you deny it's in your hand.
So I'm not sure the Europeans feel there's a dagger to their throat. And again, there's always a dagger to Ukraine's throat. It's just a little closer and a little pointier right now.
Tell me now, in the context of everything that's going on, because there's a lot of moving parts here and people are getting confused, and maybe that's the Russian idea to begin with, is that they're demanding now, they've enlarged this conversation beyond Ukraine's membership to NATO to something much grander about generally NATO expansion and whether NATO can expand, has expanded too far already, whether they should roll that back, whether NATO forces should be allowed to come anywhere close to Russia's borders. And then, there's a whole arms control discussion.
So it was always a broader conversation. Ukraine was never just about Ukraine. Ukraine is symptom and cause and just, one of the circular bits in a much broader conversation about European security, and it always has been. Russia's nervousness about Ukraine, Western nervousness about Ukraine, they're all part of a broader European security discussion. And to be fair, Russia is not asking that NATO reverse its expansion. Russia is asking that NATO move its forces back to pretty much where they were in 1997 before it expanded. So the idea being, in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the NATO member states promised that they would not permanently station forces on the territory of new member states. The way they've gotten around that is by rotating them, right? So they're not permanently there, they rotate, and major combat forces, which was never fully defined. What the Russians want then is a stronger version of that, right? Just nothing there on the territories of the new member states. The new member states,
right? So it's putting 100,000 plus troops on Ukraine's border, invading and seizing the Crimea and annexing it, stationing troops or, puppet troops in the Donbass, invading Georgia. Are any of these moves likely to bring Russia what it wants, or does it just creates a huge amount of insecurity? And that's why American and Western troops have been doing these increased rotations in NATO countries like, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, because the nervousness is reaching crisis proportions.
Right. So, and it's driven by Russian nervousness. So the Russians see NATO and NATO forces coming closer to their territory. That makes them nervous. They are particularly nervous about countries like Ukraine and Georgia and their relationships with NATO and with the EU. It's actually really worth pointing out that it was an EU association agreement that triggered the Maidan and eventually the war in 2014. So the Russians are insecure, because if the Russians are insecure, they build up and they take actions. Now, NATO member states maybe are protected because they're part of the NATO alliance, but they look at what's happening in Ukraine and they think, we just need to remind them that we have the NATO alliance. So they build up, and then the Russians become more nervous, right? So you've got this spiral and escalating tensions. And in the meantime, Ukraine is important in and of itself, right? When I say it's not just about Ukraine, that doesn't mean that Ukraine is simply a pawn in all of this. Ukraine is actually fairly important in Russia's conception of its security and in Russia's conception of this creeping NATO encroachment closer and closer on territory that Russia believes is rightfully its sphere of influence. And then you get into all of these historical debates and discussions. But, so it's worth understanding that the Russians don't think they're the bad guys, that they have a logic behind this, which is about their own security. And telling them, you're wrong, we're not out to get you, well, that's not actually going to work.
So what do you tell them? How do you bring about some kind of negotiated resolution here?
You do talk. No, so you do have these conversations, which I think is what we are seeing this week, is an effort to actually say, fine, we may not agree with your assessment of the security situation, but we understand that this is how you feel. You may not agree with how we understand the security situation, but you've got to understand this is how we feel. So what can we do that prevents war and that makes everyone feel more rather than less secure? Can we put some limits on activities, on exercises, on buildups that don't eliminate people's security blankets,
but provide some comfort to Russia?
Yeah. And this is not going to get decided this week, right? These are tough things to do. You can, and if you really want to have these agreements and arrangements, you need verification measures. This is complicated stuff. But if you can agree that this is what you're going to do, or that you're at least going to try to do it, two things happen. One, there's a chance you actually will get somewhere that will eventually be safer, and you buy time. Now, that means while you're buying the time, it can always go off the rails. It can always go back to escalation. That's a feature and a bug, right? The bug is that it can escalate, and that would be very bad. The feature is that should make everyone at least nervous enough that they stay at the negotiating table and keep talking.
Do the Russians see risk in the West buying time? That in the meantime, what happens on the ground in Ukraine causes them to lose security ground?
If it's only buying time, yes. If you actually do start taking some steps that make everyone feel more secure and no one feel less secure, then, I think it's really hard to know where, where the Pareto optimality point is, right? It's hard to understand what everyone will accept until you have these conversations and you do the push and the pull. I'm not sure it's 100% clear what NATO will accept either. NATO member states being a lot of countries with very diverse views and different threat assessments of their own. So, you do have to have these conversations.
So NATO, just to clarify, you don't think that NATO kind of dances to the music that's played in Washington, that at a certain point, some of those countries in Eastern Europe on the front line with Russia will have a lot of input into this discussion about troop deployments.
They absolutely have a lot of input into this conversation about troop deployments. And I mean, this is one of the big challenges, right? If you start talking about limiting what can be on any, kind of near borders, and you look at where, say, the borders of the Baltic states with Russia are, and you start counting kilometers away from the border, you're pretty quickly in the Baltic Sea, right? These countries aren't very large. And from the Russian perspective, you look at Kaliningrad, which is also in that area, and if you start putting any kind of geographic limitations, you've just demilitarized Kaliningrad if you haven't, very specifically exempted it. So it's a complicated conversation because of the geography. And yes, the Baltic states and Poland and Romania and Bulgaria all get a vote.
You, like the Russian deputy foreign minister, I'm not saying that you're in parallel thought on the crisis, but you see that it's not hopeless right now.
It's not hopeless. It is still very, very dangerous. The fact that he says it's not hopeless is one of the things that makes it not hopeless, right? The fact that I say it's not hopeless contributes nothing. But when he says it's not hopeless, it means he wants to keep talking. And hopefully it means that his bosses want him to keep talking, and that's a good thing.
Peter Baker, just for historical reference, of the New York Times, who's a good friend of mine, was based in Russia when I was there, wrote a piece in the New York Times this week in which he quotes James Baker, the U.S. Then Secretary of State, who was negotiating with Gorbachev when the reunification of Germany took place. There's a lot of historical perspective in there about the Russians' idea that they were given any kind of promise that NATO would never expand historically, and that the United States in particular says that the discussion was never about these areas now, these countries that have become part of NATO, because they were still Soviet countries. The Soviet Union still existed. These promises were only made not to position NATO forces in relation to East Germany as reunification was happening and as Soviet troops were withdrawing. Would you agree with that?
So there's a lot of very good historiography that parses all of this stuff. Mary Surratt's work is something I would really recommend to listeners who are interested. Her new book, Not 1 Inch, really does parse a lot of this. And
was it a broken promise?
It is a complicated situation. There was never any formal promise, right? I mean, I think we've got it on record that there was never any formal binding, commitment. There was a failure of imagination to realize that this was going to come up, and a lot of efforts to reassure the Russians.
And even Gorbachev. He doesn't stand up right now and say it was a broken promise. He says maybe it wasn't a good idea.
Gorbachev has said different things at different times. And this is the other thing. I don't know about you, but I've done some oral history. I participated in some oral history projects. My memory of things from a year ago is pretty good. My memory of things from 10 years ago is My memory of things from 20 years ago starts to be kind of mushy. And, even of things that are fairly recent, I sometimes get it wrong. So people remember, and their memories are affected by everything that's happened since. So what we've got is the documents, and the documents say no promise was made. And
by the way, I'm sorry, but from my perspective, there is no way that a firm promise was made to the Soviets or to the Russians that they wouldn't have asked, if they took it seriously, wouldn't have asked to have an agreement and have written down and have signed.
It was a weird time, though. I don't know. It was a very strange time. I don't know that anyone expected NATO, to necessarily stick around at the point that the Soviet Union collapsed. It wasn't entirely clear what was going to happen with the alliance. And the alliance indeed had a crisis of identity that lasted several decades afterwards. I think what's important, one of the things that I find frustrating when I have conversations with Russian counterparts is how much time we spend arguing about history and what happened and what didn't happen. And we are not going to convince each other of the history. So I think here too, as on the security dimension, you kind of have to agree to disagree. You kind of have to say, look, I think you are flat out wrong, but I understand this is what you believe. However, we are where we are. So given that we are where we are, where do we go from here? Let's
And,
stop
and that will be my
talking-
last question to you. Where do we go from here?
I mean, hopefully we have these negotiations. Hopefully where we go is through a long, painful process of negotiations where we limit exercises, where we limit activities and troop movements, where eventually we limit deployments, where we think about this intermediate range missile ban in Europe for all the limited military utility it has, because it might have some political utility, where we put in verification measures, where we get back to the negotiating table on Ukraine and see if we can get those Russian forces further away from Ukraine and get some progress towards peace in that country. And we do all of that in the shadow and the danger of escalation. I mean, what the Russians have is the coercive capacity, right? They feel that this is their best card. They're playing it. We may not like that, but it is a card they have to play.
Olga Oliker from the International Crisis Group. Olga, seriously, always a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, I'm joined now from Washington by Bruen, who is the president of the Global Situation Room, and he is a former U.S. diplomat. He served under the Obama administration and dealt with things like counter-crisis management strategies, specifically to deal with Russian propaganda. And Brett, I was struck by your site because it says that your counter-crisis management strategies were successful. A lot of people would debate that.
They would, and yet if you look back in the early days after Russia invaded Crimea and later Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, our first campaign was actually quite effective. We got Ukraine through elections. Russia was throwing everything and the kitchen sink to try to destabilize, to delegitimize those elections. And we stood up a task force in what was record time for the government. We're able to shore up the public debate around those elections. And in fact, to focus on and shed light on some of what Russia was doing, including moving the little green men and arms across the border. So there was great CNN investigation that looked at precisely what we did, why it worked, and then why it didn't continue. And the short answer is because we took our eye off the ball. And I, along with a few others at the White House and across the U.S. government, were pushing that we should continue to focus on information warfare as a real threat. And unfortunately, a lot of the leaders in government at that time, some of whom are now back in the Biden administration, decided that that was a soft power problem and that we needed to really focus on the hard power issues of the armaments, of the soldiers. And unfortunately, I think we've seen that propaganda can be as destructive, if not more so, to our institutions and to our public debate.
You're probably very good, like I think many journalists are, reading between the lines. Like, what are these guys really saying? And what do they really mean? What's your take on what Russia is saying, and what does it really mean? Is it really a campaign to close the doors of NATO to other countries, to push NATO back from its European flank? I mean, do you believe all that, or what's Putin really after here?
No, this is fundamentally about extracting additional concessions from the West and, quite frankly, just keeping the West on our heels. Because if we're dealing with the possibility that Putin might further invade Ukraine, then we're not looking at some of the other problems and areas in which he is meddling. So a commander that I had served with as a diplomat in Iraq was fond of saying that you can be so focused on the problem that you miss the threat. And I think we're missing the real threat here. And often with Russia, you've got to look beyond the shiny object.
The shiny object are about 100,000 objects on the border with Ukraine. And the Russians, even this week are saying, no, there's no plan to invade Ukraine. And yet, well, they know very well our satellites are looking down at them. And so there isn't much of a smokescreen there. So what is the point of denying the obvious?
Well, first, I would say, and we heard from the deputy foreign minister of Russia in Geneva this week, that we have no plans unless and until there is an incident, including one that we simply fabricate, that justifies us going into Ukraine.
Which is a danger.
Which is a real danger. But Putin is the master of making us believe that the sky is purple. And the point is, we'll look at it and it is demonstrably not purple. And yet, if he repeats it enough, and if he's able to create a smokescreen around some of the facts, and we've seen, quite frankly, other political leaders use some of these tactics. One example is the downing of MH17, the Malaysian airliner that was shot down by a Russian-backed missile over Ukraine. Now, there was a vote in the Netherlands as to the responsibility for this. And Russia ran a massive information campaign that actually convinced many people in the Netherlands, despite all of the evidence, despite the investigation of an independent commission, that somehow Russia was not responsible for this. So we really need to be aware that at the end of the day, Putin is able to lie and to cheat and to steal with, quite frankly, no challenge of the facts, no challenge of the substance. And we have to be careful about what we end up believing.
Gosh, you'd almost think he came from the KGB.
Yes, a lot of this certainly is straight out of their manual. And quite frankly, it goes back some time. And while they've modernized a lot of these tools and the tactics that they're using, fundamentally, this is an ideological war. And we need to understand that, because
what is the ideological war? And I was in Russia for 12 years, and I've covered Putin and sat with him for hours in the Kremlin. And I'm not talking as somebody who knows. I'm asking as somebody who is deeply confused. What before it was communism versus capitalism and democracy. What is it now? Liberalism and democracy versus hard, oligarchy, vertical power from the Kremlin. I mean, what is the ideological war? Or is this just about him kind of reeling from one crisis to another, imposing crises, so that he can say that there's a threat from the outside and you need me to guarantee your security in Russia?
First, before we had Make America Great Again, there was Make Russia Great Again. And that fundamentally, and has for a long time been a principal goal of Putin, to restore Russia's place on the world stage as a world power. Now, if you look at most of the factors that we consider in determining a country's power, the size of its economy, the size of its aid. These are areas where Russia is not much bigger than.
It's a small fry.
So, Putin ultimately is trying to inflate the sense of importance that Russia has. And look, militarily they remain strong, and clearly from an intelligence and an asymmetric warfare standpoint, they're also quite strong. What ultimately he's driving for is, one, certainly to stay in power and to create a system in which he has, and those that are aligned with him, have the maximum freedom of movement, both across Russia's near abroad, but in places like Syria, as well as in Iran and a number of other areas where Russia sees that they have a strategic interest. And Putin also, I think, wants to correct for some of what he sees as errors in how the Soviet Union managed their affairs. And so, at the end of the day, and it's funny because if you look at Russia today, their tagline essentially says very directly what Moscow's goal is: question more. They want us to doubt. They want us to be divided, and they just want to generally figure out how they damage our ideals and our institutions.
You served under President Obama. A lot of people would criticize President Obama and his reaction to the annexation of Crimea and the initial invasion by Russia in 2014 into Ukraine, and the handling of Georgia, and a lot more than that. But what would you say about President Biden? Is he taking the right tact right now? Is NATO taking the right tact, and the European Union taking the right tact with President Putin by saying, no, you cannot negotiate who we accept into NATO. You cannot negotiate troop movements on your flank with Europe. But we might discuss some of these other things like, the intermediate missile forces in Europe.
So I don't think they're taking the right approach when it comes to this crisis. Negotiating on any of these issues is a mistake, because Putin is only going to come back and ask for, expect, demand more. So negotiations over these issues is, in my view, justifying Putin's use of these aggressive tactics to try and extract those benefits.
And yet you're damned if you don't.
Well, I think we have to call his bluff sometimes. And I think we've got to be able to also set some clear expectations about not only what he shouldn't do, but what he needs to do when it comes to removing Russian troops from Ukrainian, Georgian, Moldovan soil, when it comes to meddling in our elections and meddling in our public debate, all of these things. And we clearly have not set up a sufficient enough deterrent for him to see those activities as being counter to his and to Russia's interests.
What would your deterrent be?
So a couple things. One, I think we got to hit him where it hurts, which is on the domestic front. And Putin is increasingly weak when it comes to public opinion in Russia. And there is a lot of information, there's a lot of intelligence that we can make public. And I think we engage in a very transparent, but also a very aggressive public information campaign. So people in Russia understand the corrupt activities, the mismanagement that's taking place in the Kremlin. That, as Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, has already demonstrated, is quite effective. And I think, it is part of a message that we deliver to Putin that says, knock it off, or we're going to give you some of your own medicine when it comes to the use of information and the power and the weaponization of that information. In this case, I think against him and against some of his allies, we have to stop with this.
You're kind of flirting with something that I'm not quite sure of. Are you saying that, the West is much more aware of where the money has been deposited, where the villas are, who controls what through what trust accounts, in this kleptocracy, and that it's time to kind of pull it out of the file and actually use it publicly with Russians?
Correct. And also just down to very basic issues. I mean, that's where we've seen Russian public outrage against how, whether it's trash is getting collected or not, how public services are delivered, how there, recently was a fire in Serbia, and, the codes and some of the corruption around building codes in Russia. All of those things, I think, ultimately are weak spots for Putin and the Russian government. It is also consistent with what we should be doing. We should be calling out corruption. We should be calling out leaders that are abusing their office and their power. I also say we have to stop talking on his terms. Right now we're debating whether or not Russia should or shouldn't invade Ukraine. We've got to start having a conversation about what we believe should be taking place both across Europe as well as in Russia. And I think that's a more difficult place for Putin when we start to create the context for a conversation that does focus on what he is or isn't providing his people. I mean, there's been a lot of economic hurt and harm to Russia over the last several years. And I think that's where Putin is weak and that we should focus.
This would go against, to wrap this up, this would go against the philosophy in the White House through the Obama years and maybe the initial presidency of Biden, that, Russia's not really consequential. Let's get on with China. Let's forget about these guys because they don't matter. And you're saying, in fact, you better deal with the problem now, and you better do so very aggressively.
I heard all of those arguments back in 2013 and 2014. I didn't believe them then, and I certainly don't believe them now. Russia has shown that they are able to project their power into our country, into other countries, and we have to be clear-eyed about that threat. And I think we also have to take much more significant steps. I mean, we've heard already some of the ideas in terms of the defensive military support that we could offer both to Ukraine as well as to other countries. I think there's a whole lot more that we could do on the intelligence front in helping them to be better equipped about what Russia is planning. And then finally, this was literally an idea that I had proposed in the Situation Room. I think we ought to set up a big, bright, shiny incubator for business or a tech center on the border with Crimea and say, we got this, what do you got? Because while often these debates come down to, I remember the policy in the Obama administration was we want a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. Often when we're talking in these very theoretic terms, we lose because Putin's making an emotional argument. So I quite literally said, our argument should be this, the iPhone. Our society, the freedom, the creativity that our society enables is building the future. And that's where we are headed, if you want to come along.
And that, by the way, was the argument in the Soviet time, wasn't it? Like, blue jeans and washing machines and
Coca-Cola.
living in a better society.
Yep. So I think we've got to boil down our arguments to something that's a lot more compelling than the democratic principles. It has to be about what people need and want today.
Brett Bruen out of Washington, the Global Situation Room. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet.
And that's our backstory for this week. I know we've done many stories recently on Russia and Ukraine. It's not my intention. But news is news. And the threat to peace in Europe is real and deserves our attention. If you have story ideas for Backstory, send me a note to dana@podcastbackstory.com. Love to hear from you. And please subscribe to my newsletter, danalewis.substack.com. I write every few days to give you a rundown on what I think are big stories, and I provide links to original news sources. Okay, 2022 is off to a good start. Stay healthy. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.